There's so many faces here. People I want to say hello to, and I'm just going to send love to you all. Thank you for being here this evening. This book, this is the first time I've read from this as a book. You know, I've given some short readings of the manuscript. There's never been a book in my hands before. This is the British edition with our American forefather there on the cover and me on the back in conversation, as it were. The editor originally wanted to put both of us on the front, like sitting face to face. We at least have, you know, a little distance between us. This book has been in progress for 15 years in one way or another. And I was interested to hear John talking about my previous book about still life painting and say it's essays, because he asked me the other day where this should go in the bookstore. Is it a biography? Is it a memoir? Is it literary criticism? Is it studies in poetry? Is it queer studies? And I suggested that maybe a small table in the middle of all those things, you know, sort of overlap zone might be formed where it could just sit. Because really, I can't put it in any one of those places. I did not want to write a book purely of literary criticism because it would have felt too impersonal to me. I did not want to write a biography because there is a fabulous one by Paul Zweig, which I recommend wholeheartedly. And I didn't want to write a memoir that left out the history of this poet who has become so important to me, such a presence in my life. And a great deal of the work of this book was simply to understand why that was the case. Why am I haunted by this man and his legacy? It was an act of looking for him to some degree. And it took a very long time because I wasn't sure what I was looking for, and I wasn't sure how to do it, and I wasn't sure what my role in it might be. To put my own life next to these poems and this person's life seemed a little dodgy to me. And I have to be honest, even up until the very end of it, I had some doubts about whether I could actually pull that off. And I was so grateful for the review in the Los Angeles Times, which was the first thing that made me say, oh, somebody I don't know read this book and got it. Okay, maybe I kind of sort of did it. So I'm going to read you just some little bits from the first chapter, and then I'll be happy to talk about whatever would interest you. And this is called On the Extremist Verge, which comes from a phrase in the preface that Whitman wrote to the first edition of Leaves of Grass, when she said, the poet must glow a moment on the extremist verge. When Walt Whitman walked through Brooklyn Heights, a sharp-aired morning, say, in the newly minted spring of 1855, headed toward the printing office of his friend Andrew Rome, did he know what he was carrying? I like imagining him, a large, roughly handsome man who appears older than his 35 years, the sense of purpose in his stride more pronounced as he approaches the shop at the corner of Fulton and Cranberry, an intersection that no longer exists, since the two streets were reconfigured in the 20th century with the creation of Cadman Plaza. I picture a portfolio under his arm, pasteboard sides covered in cloth like the green binding he'd choose for his first edition, a ribbon closure tied to keep the pages in place. Around him, the traffic of shoppers and deliverymen, errand boys, a few finer carriages, horse carts clattery and pleasingly fragrant, vendors' voices darting between the open spaces and each other's repetitive declarations of what's for sale. Brooklyn, brisk with possibility, sky rinsed a powdery blue. Adventurous little wind from the harbor, a chill still lingering on the shaded sides of streets, ordinary business, the world as it constructs itself, day after day, streaming by. Do his steps quicken or slow as he draws nearer the printer's door? Some acquaintance greets him as he passes, but the poet barely notices. His attention is fixed on the brink on which he's poised, the condition of about to become himself. In a moment, a wave of potential, the expansive dreaming overflow of his text will crash against the marble threshold and begin to become a singular fact, his longed for, dreamed of book. In a quiet room for researchers at the Library of Congress on a quiet August afternoon, I sit at a table alone while a helpful and solicitous librarian, glad, I think, for those thrilled by the proximity of great books, the intersection of the soul and time, as William Everson called them, brings me a copy of each of Whitman's first editions. I open the cardboard slipcover of the first and hold in my own hands the oversized, finished, slightly unwieldy book, set it down into the foam cradle the librarian has provided, open the cover, and turn to the first page of the first poem. The hands of a man I love, dead so many years before I was ever born, have touched this page and set these letters into type. In the blank space between spaces, I can feel the forward motion of his thinking slowing, seeming to pool here, gather, until it spills over into the next stanza. In some places, the type is broken, a printer's term for when the ink does not fill the black form of the letter evenly, a hairline crack of white shines through, or a dapple of bare papers left visible. Sometimes a little extra bit of ink pools at the top of the letter or in a period. I know it's the mechanism of printing that has made these rough marks, making this page handmade, allowing me to touch the letters and feel their impress into the weave of the paper. Don't be alarmed, the library doesn't ask one to wear gloves. Gloves have been found to do more harm than good when handling archival material. A poet, Whitman wrote, in the preface to this 1855 edition, glows a moment on the extremist verge. It seems to me that glow is pouring through this page, from behind it, even through the broken type, so bright the words seem nearly tattered and burned by it. The author of these pages had a third-grade education, if the endless recitation of drills that comprised Brooklyn public schooling in the 1830s can be called that. At 11, the age around which many boys of his era began to work and learn a trade, he apprenticed to a printer. In the years before the publication of his book, he'd work as a printer and journalist, a combination common at the time, an itinerant school teacher in small Long Island towns, a bookseller, a carpenter, a builder of houses. Had he died before the curious, oversized first edition of Leaves of Grass was published, it's unlikely we'd ever have heard his name. You'd think something in the early work of Walt Whitman would suggest the intelligence and scope, the sly wit and visionary luminosity of the pages stacked and wrapped in his ribbon portfolio. When he made his agreement with Andrew Rome, he was 35, and his publications consisted of a handful of forgettable poems and a larger quantity of windy prose, editorial pieces, melodramatic short stories, and urban mysteries serialized in newspapers and a crocheted temperance novel. But there's nothing at all to make us suspect that this man will write a decent poem, much less reinvent American poetry. He would pay to publish his book, write many of the reviews of it himself, sell precious few, if in fact any copies, and then go right on to publish a second edition. Who would have thought it would be a book that we have never finished reading, one that would be translated into every language in which poetry might be read, a book people around the globe are holding at the moment you read this page, one he never finished writing, but simply revised and expanded until it was stretched some 30 years later into a lumpen thing, almost beyond recognition. A book of presumption and daring, expansiveness and wild ambition, one with few antecedents, yes, but startlingly original, unlike anything that had ever been written before. Where on earth did it come from? You can ask that question of any poem, and one inevitable answer is the simple one: work. No made thing springs up unbidden, even those that seem to. The poem that announced itself to the intoxicated Coleridge before a knock at the door banished most of it from memory, or the composition that sprung full-blown into the head of Mozart as he stepped down from a carriage after a satisfying dinner, seemed to pour from the artist's hand, so long schooled those hands had become. But years of labor informed those spontaneous productions. Though a poem over which one struggles may seem labored, it often prepares the way for new writing in which what's been learned emerges with an effortless grace. In the end, though, work accounts for a poem of genius about as much as plumbing accounts for the fountains of Rome. It yields a necessary basis, practical scaffolding that underlies the whole, but in itself engender a sense of transport. To shift the figure from water to another element, labor may give a poem a ruddy glow, but no amount of it will set the page on fire. The great poems of Leaves of Grass are spectacularly, uniquely on fire. There are, I admit, only a handful of them, although one is long enough that you can wander in it like a labyrinth, uncertain of where you're headed, but gradually, undeniably arriving someplace entirely new. The brilliant mid-century American poet and critic Randall Jarrell wrote that a good poet is someone who manages, in a lifetime of standing out in thunderstorms, to be struck by lightning 5 or 6 times. A dozen or 2 dozen times, and he is great. Who besides Shakespeare might have been struck by lightning 2 dozen times, I cannot say. Even in the life's work of many of our greatest poets, a few dazzling electrical flashes are brighter than all the rest. We think no less of John Keats because he didn't write more of those odes, or of Elizabeth Bishop because her final collection, Geography 3, wasn't longer. And what daring, heat, and light Whitman's masterworks emit. They proceed with absolute confidence to make the wildest claims, inventing a cosmogony, a theology, a stance toward reality. They burn with evangelical urgency that insists that no one requires a spiritual teacher. They find the basis for a social compact in the common bedrock of the desiring human body, and sing the inclusive, generous, common self in a mode so formally inventive that its first readers must have wondered if this was poetry at all. The combination of unbridled content and unfamiliar form seems to have left even readers of undeniable acumen in the dust. Emily Dickinson is said to have taken a peek inside and then firmly closed the book. Henry James noted with devastating simplicity, "This will not do." I would like to think that writers of such genius, whatever they may have said, recognized as kin the astonishing outpouring of work that appeared from the hands of a self-educated rough from Brooklyn, but there is no evidence that they did. There is surely an uncomfortable sort of admiration and kinship expressed in a letter from the great tormented Jesuit poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, though. I always knew in my heart Walt Whitman's mind to be more like my own than any other man's living. As he is a very great scoundrel, that is not a pleasant confession. I'll give you just another page and a half. This is about when the first edition appears. Self-published, big, in imitation of coffee table book, parlor table book, stamped gold on the green cover, no author's name anywhere inside. The thin, oversized book was, to put it plainly, weird. It was bound in green cloth and stamped in gold with roots, branches, and green grains woven together to form the letters of the title, in imitation of a popular book, Fern Leaves from Fanny's Portfolio, by Whitman's friend Sarah Willis. Under the name Fanny Fern, Willis published newspaper columns widely read by and circulated among women at mid-century, so widely, in fact, that her first book had sold some 70,000 copies, in which she earned a dime apiece, enough to land her financial independence and a townhouse in Brooklyn. Whitman admired her, not least for her success. Open Whitman's book, and after the obligatory white page, a visible moment of silence, is the engraved image of a man, not one a poetry reader at the time would have expected to meet. No gentleman in serious clothes, authority backed by laden bookcases, maybe a classical bust looming behind. No romantic in a loose cravat, looking dreamily toward the Empyrean, tethers to earth loosened by fevers or opiates. The engraving was based on a photograph of Whitman now lost, which is unusual in that he would photograph often and carefully save those images. Here he's a slouch-hatted workman, outfit and demeanor radically informal. His undershirt shows behind his open collar. It isn't easy to name the attitude his facial expression and posture convey. Certainly there's a relaxed quality in the tilt of the pelvis, the easy way his shoulders fall, and the slouch of the hat. But the angle of the face, the narrowed eyes and slightly raised eyebrows have a quality of assessment about them. Is he taking our measure? You could take that hand on the hip as a cocky gesture, as if he's looking up and down and saying, "Well, who are you?" Affectionate, haughty, electrical, he writes. I am this mystery. Here we stand. Haughty and electrical, I can see, but affectionate? Not a quality this image suggests, but what I'm reading as an evaluative gaze may in fact be a not altogether successful representation of something else. The look of one still dreaming, the way new infants sometimes still seem to gaze upon something they've not yet fully left behind. These are the opening pages of the book, our author, the title, and that's it. No author's name is given, cover, spine, or opening pages, save for in the tiniest of italic fonts in the center of an Antarctic page, these words, entered according to an act of Congress in the year 1855 by Walter Whitman in the clerk's office of the District Court of the United States for the Southern District of New York. You have to reach page 29 to find Walter Whitman's new name, the name of the man he became to write these poems, Walt Whitman, an American, one of the roughs, a cosmos. Imagine self-publishing your first book and not putting your name on it. Asked about this oddity years later by the worshipful young secretary Horace Traubel, the elderly poet replied, I suspect quite sincerely, it would have been like putting a name on the universe. In other words, he is not, in the usual sense, the author, or not entirely so. Leaves of Grass is a kind of collaboration with reality, and Whitman believed wholeheartedly that it was given to him. Although disguised as a volume of parlor verse, in its decorous binding, the book was from its inception a provocation, an assault, an outcry, a gospel. I like to imagine those pages before they were set into type, the energy not yet released from them, compressed until it would explode in a movement that continues unabated as I write 164 years later. There's a beginning.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. You answered one of my questions before you read, which was how long, you said it took you 15 years to write this book, because I imagine with a collection of poems, you sort of have enough poems that you realize you have a book. But for something like this, you have to have the conviction that you have enough to say, or enough of a relationship with a figure like Whitman to write a whole book about him. And when did that conviction start?
The first draft of this book was really an attempt to just sort of get my hands around this massive body of work, not just the poems, but also his prose and his letters and writing about him. I felt like I was climbing Mount Whitman. You know, I just had to describe this thing, go to the summit. And it was a big, baggy, unreadable draft, basically. It then began a process of figuring out, well, what do I have to say about this? You know, what is it about this that I want to be the through line and direction of this book? And I think there are two. One is I wanted to try to figure out those sources. What on earth made this fountaining of great poetry happen? And I wound up organizing the book into sections, which think about that. One of them certainly is a kind of what we would call a transcendent experience, a peak experience, a mystical experience. I think that this man experienced a very profound kind of experience of the loss of boundary between self and other, of a merger with everything around him, what we would sometimes call enlightenment. It is undescribed except in the poem. There are no witnesses, of course. There's no, external account of it. But this poem, Song of Myself especially, glows with vision. It's radiant with a sense of connection to all things, all living things, and not living things as well. He's very friendly towards stones and moss and all, sticks. There's a great surging joy in being part of the universe in that poem. And you could feel it over his best work, gradually cooling and diminishing. He shrinks back into a more human self. By the time we get to Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, which is the last one I talk about in the book, he is also someone who is lonely, who suffers, who doubts himself, and yet still feels that connection at the same time. He can both feel it and want it. So that's one of the sources. Another is queer sex. This is a guy who I think was an early member of a new category of identity. He, many people in his time, of course, had sex with members of their own sex, but it wasn't viewed, it seems, as who you were. It was a behavior, not a sense of a person. And Whitman is an early example of an urban man who creates an identity for himself as somebody who loves other men, who takes great pleasure in sexual activity. And he tries to be, he tries to be, I guess, bisexual in the poems. He presents himself as also being interested in women. He never pulls it off. You just don't quite believe it. Every time he talks about women, there's sort of, as E.H. Lawrence said, a function. He's very interested in maternity and women as bearing children. The eros isn't there. But in his writing about men, it's palpable, clear. So that kind of experience, because it was really not named in his time, because it was outside the margin of things, I think it allows you to see in a different way. The Marxist critic, Herbert Marcuse, said that any kind of experience that is illegal will help you to see into the society in which you live. He was referring to smoking marijuana. And he said, as soon as it's legal, it doesn't teach you anything. It's like having a beer. But when it's not legal, there's a kind of a way in which you participate in the outside. You're on the other side of the law, looking back in to what is acceptable. I think that was true for queer sex too. So that also meant contact with a kind of energy and with the spiritual life and energetic life of others that was enormously important to him. The city was also a great source for Whitman. Being a New Yorker, a city that was a brand new kind of place where Americans were flocking because it was depression in the 1840s, people needed jobs. And so young people were leaving the country, moving from the farms and small towns where they were known, where their identity was sort of locked into family and tradition, into a city where you could kind of be anybody right now. The population of New York increased radically in the first half of the 19th century. Many people who were living in rooming houses and collective situations. They were hungry to get out and have fun. They were hungry for each other. There was a whole different climate about New York. And of course, Whitman's a kind of quintessential New Yorker in a lot of ways. He's a self-promoter. He always has an answer to everything. He's got a shy bone in his body. It's here I am. There's a chutzpah about him that's very appealing. to me. When he was, for instance, during the years that he worked as a volunteer nurse in the makeshift hospitals after the Civil War in D.C., and he was it was a very moving labor. He was carrying fruit and oranges to soldiers. He was writing letters home to them and reading letters to the illiterate. He was also sending press releases to the Boston Globe saying the poet Walt Whitman is visiting soldiers. So that kind of is an example of the way he could be very sincere and very much a person presenting himself to the world as well. There was also a time when new American language was booming. There was so much innovation in industry, technology, in the arts. Whitman went to a huge exhibition at the Crystal Palace, where Bryant Park is now, and he saw there this exposition of the sort of human labor of all time, human industry. So it told all kinds of things. He wandered through this exhibition with a little green notebook, writing down the names of stones, fossils, kinds of plants, industrial processes. He's hungry for this vocabulary. And there are many words in Whitman which are decidedly unpoetic by 19th century standards. He's bringing all this American speech, casual diction into the poems. So those things are all elements of his poetry which kind of come together in amazing synthesis to make something entirely new. He also was following Emerson. He had heard in the 1840s, Ralph Waldo Emerson came to New York, and he gave a talk which later would become his essay, The Poet. And in it he says, how come we don't have an American poet who really speaks of this continent yet, who brings an American place names, American animals, American life, and is ours? Where is that person? Brooklyn. And his poems sort of break loose from the traditions of rhyme and meter, for the most part, a kind of European form, and a sense of decorum and constraint. If you look at Emerson's poems next to his, Emerson was a brilliant man. The poems, they're hobbled by form. Look at the Rose poems, nothing like his prose. Whitman is the one who as he says, takes the doors from the jam, busts loose, makes a new kind of poetry possible. I forgot the question in that somewhere. Okay, so get that and figuring out, why is it about? Why does he want me? And I don't know that I finally get the answer to that, except that I'm totally overcome by admiration and shock, awe at what he was able to do.
Right. How much, I wondered throughout, when you mentioned the Henry James line about Whitman's poetry saying, this will not do. There's a remarkable quote from a review that Rufus Griswold, am I a fool for not knowing who Rufus Griswold is? Right. He reviewed Whitman in 1855 and wrote, "It is impossible to imagine how any man's fancy could have conceived such a mass of stupid filth unless he were possessed of the soul of a sentimental donkey that had died of disappointed love. This poet, without wit, but with a certain vagrant wildness, just serves to show the energy which natural imbecility is occasionally capable of under strong excitement." A brutal takedown. And Whitman is one of the sort of geniuses misunderstood in his lifetime. And I wondered how much, was there a desire on your part to, obviously people recognize Whitman's genius now, but was part of the desire to write this book to correct the historical record or the contemporary impressions of who Whitman is and why he matters?
Yes, but in a different way than you're describing or you're pointing towards. Whitman took Griswold's review and he pasted it in the back of the second edition of Lazy Best. He lost attention. He was pleased to have attention more. Excuse me, I'm going to grab the plug for my computer so that we don't run out of juice here. That'd be good. Let's see. Found it. Okay. Excuse me for the interruption.
No, it's okay.
There's actually another room here. It would be a bigger disaster for the screen to go black than for me. So Mr. Griswold was a very prominent anthologist in his day. He was very famous. And he had a lot of power over what poets got read and what poets didn't. And he made sure that Whitman, of course, was not included in his. Okay, he made sure that Whitman was not included in his anthologies, and he also was known for having written a sort of obituary for Edgar Allan Poe that was utterly vicious. Really, it's about what a low-life Poe is and it was so vividly awful in its description of the addicted Poe stumbling through the streets of Philadelphia and falling in gutters that it kind of made Poe's career posthumous. Made everybody very interested in him. Now, a little more light. Excuse me. Come on. You see, I do so well with technology, you know? Can you see okay?
Oh, yeah.
Lights all right? Okay. I don't think Whitman was much touched by that. I think he very much wanted to be heard. And if people were upset about it, well, then that was kind of use about that. There was something valuable about being attended to. I think what I would like to set straight is the fact that Whitman was enormously well regarded in his lifetime. He became quite successful for his patriotic poems, particularly for his Lincoln elegy, "Oh Captain, My Captain," which is the worst poem he ever wrote. It's a rhymed and metered elegy for Lincoln. It's jingoistic. You can memorize it. You could probably play it on the drums with no problem. And there's still high school kids reciting that poem. I had trouble reading Whitman when I was younger because he seemed to be such a nationalist and was so came encrusted with a kind of American identity that I was uncomfortable with at that time. I wanted to sort of chip away at that stuff. Why do we have a Walt Whitman bridge, in Philadelphia, a Walt Whitman service area in New Jersey, a Walt Whitman mall in Long Island? The real Walt Whitman, I think, is much more radical, much stranger than those things would suggest. I wanted to, in some ways, I guess, give him back his sexiness and his strangeness.
Oh, that's wonderful. I have a question here from Tabea in Washington, D.C. She said, of Whitman's journalism that you read for the book, what surprised you most in your research?
Well, I was appalled, something really appalling, which is later in his life, he made some racist statements that were just so out of character and so unfortunate. It's hard to understand because this is a man who wrote such passionate poetry proclaiming human equality and egalitarianism in the 1850s. The great anti-slavery poem of that century, I think, is Whitman in I Sing the Body Electric, and Whitman goes to a slave auction, and he tells the auctioneer, "You don't know what you're doing. You don't know how to do it. Let me do it." And he stands up and says to the potential bidders, "This man is worth more than any of you could possibly ever pay for him. His blood is your blood. What would you pay for that?" It's a really biting, bitter denunciation of slavery. And yet later, he says some things that are just absurd. So that was an unfortunate discovery. What was a much better discovery was how much pleasure he takes in looking at the natural world, in being able to embrace playfulness. He writes in his book Specimen Days, which is probably the first disability memoir. It's a book that in bits and pieces, because that's all he could manage to do at that point after a major stroke, describes moments in his life, little things collected. And among them are these sort of great praises to skinny dipping and to naked sunbathing and how much he loves the light on his skin and the warmth of the day. And that's just beautiful. Who would have thought to see that?
I do think this book is also a great book about the city, about New York City. And so I wanted to ask a question
of Ned
from your book twice. Let me find the first passage. Well, the first is from very early in the book. Oh, is that Ned?
That should do it. That's Ned.
Hi, Ned.
I'm not letting you go on for long with that.
So very early in the book, when you set out what you're trying to accomplish, you say, of the many poets I love, none has haunted me as Walt Whitman has. I want to keep company with him in this book, want to account for his persistent presence in my life. And then the second thing I want to quote for this question is, from much later in the book, you write about New York. Maybe it isn't so great, the distance from claiming oneself a citizen of the cosmos, inseparable from the great stream and pulse of life, to being a resident of Manhattan. Since I live there myself, I'm aware that some readers will see my conflation of New York and the cosmos as a symptom of a certain narrowness of vision. Maybe so, but New York is, after all, the very image of the fullness of being, a capital of the human. What is unavoidable here is the grand range of human feeling, every aspect of who we are more or less on continuous display. Ambition and aspiration, triumph, pettiness, despair and hunger, vanity, rage, sorrow and delight. Everything about us shows here and cannot quite be tucked away. New York City insists, as it pretty much seems to have always done, on indulging, or on including everything, excuse me. So at this very strange time for New York City, I was wondering who you're keeping company with now in your reading, whether it's Whitman still or anybody else. Who are you turning to now in your reading life?
Well, I've been reading poets and mostly, an odd bunch, eclectic bunch. There's Ross Gay, a poet I'm sure many people here know, is a wonderfully affirmative writer, and it's just like a tall, full drink of water in these times. There's nourishment in the poems. He has a poem in which he's refusing despair, and it's called "Sorrow Is Not My Color," and the last line is, "I'm spraying, I'm green." Or I'm green, I'm spring. I'm so grateful for that, because look around us, here's this fantastic spring, and it's really kind of hard to just simply take pleasure in it, right? How much can you enjoy these glorious trees who are doing their best, you know? He reminded me too, and that's quite wonderful. That poem, by the way, those lines are based on a poem by Gwendolyn Brooks called, To the Young People Who Want to Die, and it's about, she's speaking to adolescents who are suicidal, and she's in a very rational way saying, no, that's not what you need to do. You need to be here. You're spring, you're green. Okay, this is my last attempt to fuss with the power before. I think we're fixed. Okay, great. So that, and I'm reading a long novel, which seems like a good occupation for these days, not because I have so much time, but just because of being able to be absorbed in something continuous, because my time sense is on the fritz. Sometimes some days seem very long, other times things move very quickly. I'm not sure what day it is. I want to recommend an odd feeling that comes in isolation. I'm reading The Mysteries of Winterthurn by Joyce Carol Oates, who is my dear colleague at Rutgers these days, and it's a delight. It's heavily, very drippily artificial and enjoyable.
It is also National Poetry Month, so if you'll permit me one more quotation and question from the middle of your book. Whitman couldn't have known what his innovations, the way he opened both formal possibilities and new territories for content, would mean to poets to come, both in his home country and around the world. He'd hoped to change his country, to provide the founding text of a new order. What he changed was poetry, which indeed does change the world, but quietly, a reader at a time. Could you speak to that quietly world-changing quality that poetry has, what it means to you, and what it might mean to all of us?
I think everyone who is a reader of poetry knows that there's a certain kind of restoration that comes to us through this form, a connection to the inner life of another person, a connection to the subjectivity of another. Of any art form, I would say poetry is that which is most capable of giving us a guess, a feeling for the subjectivity of another person. I know that can't actually be captured. You can never totally know what it's like to be someone else, but poetry is maybe the most clear window into interiority. That's a real gift. And it's also constantly a reminder that wherever you are, you're not alone there. You know, the poem's ability to talk about despair, to talk about grief, to talk about loss, to talk about the possibility of moving forward through those things, you know, to be connected to growth, to be connected to animal life here. You know, those are possibilities that poetry holds out to us. Whitman so wanted to be able to both change individual consciousnesses and also change what democracy was for us. He wanted to propose a social compact that was founded on our affection for each other. And what he saw instead, of course, was the bodies torn to pieces in the hospitals in Washington after the Civil War. Profound devastation to him. I don't think he ever actually recovered from that. What you see after that is a poetry that is much more compromised, that is much more limited in its reach, and frankly, much more sentimental. I mean, the grand passion of the earlier work is replaced by attempts to console that fail. What could console in the light of all that devastation? But the power, the vision articulated in the earlier work and in the best of the later poems doesn't go away. It isn't broken or destroyed by loss or by grief. It simply is a little quieter, bubbling along under the surface and still available.
Well, I'm happy to cede the floor to anybody if anybody has any other questions for Mark. But I too, my sense of time has been reconfigured by all this, and I have not had the easiest time focusing on any kind of prose. But when I got your book last week, I found it eminently easy to read, enjoyable to read and listen to, and I think you will too.
You read it, was striking to be like, oh my goodness, it feels like a session. You know?
Yeah.
Sounds good to me. So.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us, and go to McNallyJackson.com and get your copy tonight. We'll ship it out as soon as we can. And thank you, Mark, so much for being our first guest in this new reality. I hope you enjoyed yourself too.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you for putting up with my sort of technical lack of facility. I'm getting better. You know, I'm teaching my classes online too. This is not an easy adjustment.
Thank you to Ned too as well.
Enjoy this.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Good night. Thank you all.